sacrifice, which a lot of times people think of sacrifice as giving up, but really what sacrifice, these ideas of renunciation, that's really about sacrificing your own ignorance, your own limits. So it's quite often that people reach out to me for advice. They can say things like, I feel lost. What do I do about it? And it could be relationship problems. It could be divorce. It could be stress over finances. There's really many, many things about it. But what I see is that people tend to kind of lose heart. They lose their mental game. They're no longer acting in a way that is creating the best results for them. And there's an internal approach to that once adopted can help lift us up and over. So they're almost psyched out. They're almost outside of themselves. They've lost before they've even started. So what do you do about it? If you feel lost, what do you do about it? So it's important to understand that you determine the results of your life. You and you alone, your actions. We've all been dealt different cards, different hands, different life experiences. But from where you stand right now, your choices, your actions, and your thoughts will largely determine your future. So if you can simplify that, you can basically say there's good actions, thoughts, and there's bad actions and thoughts and results. Now, the way that we typically talk about this is there's the demonic path, or some people call it the degenerate path, and then there's the divine path, or the uplifting path, or like walking upstairs step by step towards something greater. And it's very simple, actually. If you practice degenerate qualities, then you just sink further and further into depression and anger and this whole wheel of suffering that you're revolving around. Now, if you can see that, then you can understand that these are going to be the root causes a lot of the suffering. These are the root causes of a lot of the suffering, okay? So if you can overcome these, let's say, degenerative qualities, then you can follow a more uplifting path. And people who are devoted to that path, they take refuge in their very self. They find a way to always be supported. They're always making the best out of situations. So let's just go a general overview of how to identify uplifting or divine actions. And then we'll talk a little bit about the degenerative qualities, not to focus on them, but to identify them, not to, focus on the negative, but to understand them. So here's some of the qualities of this uplifting divine path. There's fearlessness, purity of your heart and emotions, steadfast persistence in evolution and understanding, charity, control of your senses, because remember, sensual gratification is one of the deepest pits we can invest into to lead us to suffering. And I'll explain that. Sacrifice, which a lot of times people think of sacrifice as giving up, but really what sacrifice, these ideas of renunciation, that's really about sacrificing your own ignorance, your own limits, giving up a pattern that is no longer helpful so you can be a larger version of yourself. Study of scripture or ideas that expand your mind and your heart. Self-purification, which a lot of times we talk about that as austerities, or the Sanskrit word is tapas. Tapas meaning self-purification. Like a blacksmith will melt down ore. A lot of the secret practices that we do, they refine your character in this same way. There's a self-purification to the practices, which lead you into a higher order. The example I'm using with a blacksmith is they'll melt down ore and perhaps they'll make a tool, which then can be used to fix something along those lines. More of the divine uplifting attitudes once adopted. Straightforwardness, which of course is integrity and sincerity. We've also got non-injury. Of course, everyone talks about the Sanskrit interpretation, ahimsa, which is when you're not inflicting mental or physical or spiritual harm on people. Most people understand physical violence, but they don't really bring it over into the mental. A lot of times we communicate through pressure and punishment, and we try to control other people. It's a very violent form of speech. The great author Marshall Rosenberg has an amazing book on nonviolent communication that really can take anyone's relationships to the next level. And he really talks about how violence is not just physical, it's also with our words. He talks about jackal speech. And the basic way to understand that is that a lot of times we were just trained to influence and pressure other people to get what we want. And a lot of times, not only is that not the most effective way to do it, but you're actually communicating in a way that inflicts mental or spiritual harm. So non-injury or ahimsa is one of those divine qualities. Again, we have truthfulness, absence of anger, turning away from worldly attachments and renunciation, equanimity, not slandering, not coveting or desirous, giving up selfishness, compassion, gentleness, not being fickle, forgiveness, being of clean mind and body, and no hate and no pride. So what these do is they reveal a more clear version of ourselves that has not been tainted by domestication, that has not been tainted by the past. So let's say you have a certain experience. Well, the psychotherapies tell us about a theory called classical conditioning, which basically means if I've had an experience, you tend to think that it leaves an impression in your psyche, which you can replay out. A classic example is, let's say you go to a restaurant and you have some oysters, something along those lines. You get food poisoning. Well, the next time you go to the restaurant, no, I don't want those oysters. But sometimes the action to consequence, there's something in between there that you might not repeat that action. What I'm saying is people play out the same patterns, the same scripts. Okay? So what these do is they reveal your true nature that is beyond a lot of those scripts. You start to pull back those layers, the cognitive distortions, the white or black thinking, the overgeneralization, the over-emotionalizing, the rationalizing, the blaming, the hypersensitivity, all these things that we get stuck in that limit our perspective and our ability to access the happiness and the potential that's right around us. I always say that life is always here. There's always, every day has a new potential, but most people, they simply can't grab it because of their anxiety, because of their fear. They just can't grab the potential that's around them. So let's talk a little bit about, and a lot of those qualities are very obvious when you think about them, and you really tend to contemplate, well, would, for example, selfishness, giving up selfishness, how can that limit your experience? Well, selfish people can act almost as a cancer. So what I'm saying is, of course, you have to take care of yourself. And I don't ever think you should sacrifice yourself in the sense that you should make yourself smaller to give to someone else, because that's not what we mean by giving up selfishness. What we mean is this destructive, misdirected greed and desire that many people, for them, it's operating just underneath the surface. So they act as a cancerous element. By that, I mean they really turn against the whole, and then they start to consume the whole at detrimental eventually to themselves, because eventually in the sake of cancer uncontrolled, the host dies and the cancer dies eventually as well. So it's like burning the forest just to plant your own tree. It's kind of silly, isn't it? So obviously a lot of these things, they're nuanced and you will need to consider them to understand them instead of just discard them. But they reveal your true nature beyond a conditioned self, beyond a domesticated self, beyond a eliminated self. And that is honestly a beautiful journey that everyone should be open to taking. So, but what is that limited self? What are the more negative qualities, the degenerative qualities that we sometimes start to incorporate into our personality and become part of our personality and who we are? So, of course, you have pride, ostentatiousness, hypocrisy, pompousness, and arrogance, vanity, deceit, anger, and harshness, which is, just this coarse, sternly judgmental attitudes. And I think really the biggest thing about these negative qualities is you can get into a mode where you really can't discriminate between what is real and not real. You have an emotion, you feel something, so it must be real. Well, a feeling is not necessarily truth. An opinion is not necessarily fact. The way it is the way it is real, but we can trick ourselves. We have a lot of ways that we distort reality. So when we engage in these states of mind, we tend to lose the ability to discriminate between real and not real, fact and fiction. In fact, many people turn truth into false and false into truth. And ultimately engaging in these ideas and letting them become part of your personality and who you are just leads to more suffering for you. Now, that's something that you'll have to really question and think through and reason out how you're participating, if you're participating, and if that's even true, even if you decide it's best not to be vain, not to be full of pride. But it's important to understand that you may have an opinion on it, but you can almost certainly see it's self-evident that those things, being coarsely, sternly judgmental to the point of cruelty and full of greed, is generally speaking not going to be good for you. And what I'm offering here is that these divine behaviors or these uplifting behaviors lead to liberation. They lead to an internal freedom. They lead to this quality where happiness is not dependent on an external situation, where it's just your present reality because you've removed those negative qualities from your personality. You've become a more liberated soul in that sense. So the divine behaviors lead to that liberation. And those degenerate behaviors lead to more time in the wheel of suffering. And there's a lot of freedom in that once you identify that. If you can, maybe you accept it as truth, but even just contemplating it and thinking about it, because we all have degrees of these. We all have degrees of coarseness or anger or harshness or pride or vanity. We have degrees of those in our personality. What I'm offering is that they don't really serve us, that we can choose to let go of those things consciously and ultimately work towards self-purifying ourselves and removing those things as our personality and becoming a more embodiment of that higher way, that way based on truth and love and compassion, more in tune with your the refined capabilities of what humans have to offer. So if you're lost, if you've ever felt lost, if you want to know a direction, I'm giving you a simple tool here. Don't engage in degenerative behaviors, which are by their very nature degenerative. They pull everything down. They just destroy themselves and yourself. It's extremely obvious. And engage in uplifting activities. Engage in things that lift you over. Because what happens is when you engage in those activities, you become more resilient. You become more effective in the world, actually. So it's a beautiful story. And I'll just wrap it up with this one point right here. So Our job is to take truth and to make it simple and understandable and relatable for you and other people to benefit from it. So really, there's two main points about this. One is that there's certain knowledge that can lead you to a greater experience or truth, okay? And it's in any area of life. In financial areas of life, there's certain knowledge and understanding that will expand your financial capabilities, saving, investing, increasing income, whatever. There's tons and tons of theories about that, okay? And what I'm saying is that knowledge that leads you to truth in whatever field will eventually bring freedom. So in relationships, you want better relationships? Well, knowledge that leads you to truth. Vidya, it's relationships, it's spiritually, it's mentally, it's emotionally. If you just seek out that knowledge, you will eventually overcome the limits that you're experiencing, feelings of hopelessness or loss or whatever it may or may not be. And we've all experienced those. We've all experienced the high highs of life and the low lows. But we can slowly, there's always hope. So getting the knowledge in that aspect, in that area of life, whatever area you want to grow in, educate yourself in that, because it's easier to educate yourself sometimes than to change. It's hard to be a better time manager, but it's easy to learn about time management. It's hard to change a behavior, quit smoking, but it's easy to research ideas about it. And through that knowledge, it's going to lead you through the trees, past the forest. Okay? The next point that builds on that is simply understanding that it's simple when you think about it. Know what the right choices are and live up to it. It's easier than you think. You can look to wise people. You can look to the scriptures. You can look to science for truth. It's that we sometimes live in opinions. We live in distortions. We live in anger. We don't live in truth. So seek out the truth, the way that the world really is, not what you think, not what you feel. And then once you know what is right and what you know what is wrong, just live up to that. It's easier than you think. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I invite you to support this community, share this with your friends, and let me know what you think. Really appreciate you. Thank you.